Well, I think we can start our session, which is on avant-garde publishing. And we start with Stephen Bury from New York. He's Andrew Mello, Chief Librarian of the Frick Art Reference Library in New York. And he's known for his scholarship on artists' book. He curated many exhibitions on artists' book and published a lot on artists' book. Just to name a few, he curated the exhibition Breaking the Rules, the printed face of the European avant-garde, 1900 to 1933. And he is author of Artist's Book, the book as an artwork from 1963 to 1995. And also Artists, Multiples and Multiplications. These are just a few books he published, and he became known for his activities on Artist's Book. And now I leave the stage to Stephen Bury. Welcome to Brussels, to our conference, and we are very interested in your presentation. Welcome.
So I'd like to thank Laura and her team for their invitation and for helping with all the technical matters. An international semi-virtual conference is the most difficult of things to do, I think. And I'm going to start with a look back of an exhibition that I did at the British Library November 2007 to March 2008. It was called Breaking the Rules, but the subtitle of the exhibition and the catalogue was The Printed Face of the European Avant-Garde 1900 to 1937. I'll get back to why I finished at 1937 later on in a later slide. But it was great fun to do. It was filling in a slot, so I only had a year to prepare, organize any loans, and produce a catalogue and work with the designer, which was Philip Hughes. But it was great fun, and it brought my one of my departments together, because at the British Library, I merged the Eastern European with the Western European sections. Wasn't much for my popularity in either section, but this exhibition really was a way of bringing everybody together and celebrating many of the recently escaped nations from the Soviet bloc. It's sort of ironic, as a previous speaker said today, that we're in a similar situation now. So the thesis of the exhibition was really to look at the European avant-garde using the printed format. Not just in paintings, in collage, as in a Schwitters, but also as a space where they could actually make art and was art. So that was the proposition. It does end, the exhibition ends with some films of the Nazi book burnings, which was a sort of commentary in two ways on the end of the sort of avant-garde through Nazification, but also the coming of film and film replacing the book. But that's another story. So moving into the second slide, you can see that the visitor had to go down this sort of steps after that introduction from the first. And we began with a series of general thematic discussions of manifestos, of art periodicals and artist periodicals, livre d'artistes and artist books, photo books, and you name it, anything in print. And then it looked at it country by country, again using those material formats, but also introducing people and other themes like war or the role of sport. Ironically, we were talking football earlier, but we'll see a slide later on. So the manifesto was the key to much of this, and of course it's not an exclusive thing published by itself, because the first, futurist manifesto of Marinati was in Le Figaro, but actually in an Italian magazine 2 weeks before. So manifestos actually pervaded some of the other formats too. So for me, the underlying sort of core of a manifesto is that section of pro and con, what's pink and what's murder, what is good or bad, futurist or passéist. And you see on the right that the Nazis in 1937, the end of my exhibition period, almost reversed the format, and they were proclaiming avant-garde art as bad and their particular version of classicism as good, a sort of inversion of the avant-garde manifesto. Magazines, I've just chosen a random Blast, which I think is a forgotten magazine in the European avant-garde, mainly because it was English. But it was very formative on the designs of Zara and of later people like Liszewski. Dada 3, which was a sort of 1918 publication from Zurich, starts to show you the avant-garde really playing around with the magazine format and its fragility, and the idea you could have a woodcut just stamped on the front of it, and you could have tight running angles and things like that. So I sort of started to look at the magazines in a sort of new way, because I was starting to find that, as yesterday we were talking about the Dada aesthetic, and the one here on the left, which was published by Malik Publishers, which included the Hartfield brothers, the Herzfeld brothers, and this has a collage by John Hartfield of the Eber, the German Chancellor, Social Democratic Chancellor, cabinet as a fan. And of course, on the top left, we have a football swallowed by somebody. Yeah, you could do a whole exhibition on football on the avant-garde, but that's another subject. But on the right, I started to notice that a lot of later Dada magazines were limited editions. This one comes from the Spencer collection at New York Public Library, and it's been always a bit of a mystery because it doesn't fit the special format of the ones elsewhere described in libraries, and it certainly isn't the standard format of this magazine. And it turns out, when I sort of examined it, that this was just really an off-print of the prints that were sort of like sort of put together in a sort of folder, masquerading as the actual anthology Dada. And artist books was another theme, and of course we're getting to the sort of margin between artist books and livre d'artiste with the Sondra and Delaunay prose of the Trans-Siberian. Again, we're going to talk about that a bit later, but that obviously was an edition of 150. And on the right is the Zara 25 poems of 1918. We don't know for sure what the original edition, the non-limited edition, was. I'm guessing around 250, but nobody knows for sure. The luxury edition is quite interesting because, in the discussions of the art on the first day, we're in a very sort of similar sort of mode here on the front of and it also is very reminiscent of the future the Russian and Ukraine futurist books that we're going to briefly look at. And there's on the right is the limited edition statement. There's 10 on Holland paper. Moving rapidly. So as I said, things were then divided by country, by city, and we had about 20 cities, and Paris, of course, had a bigger space than many of the others. So this is Apollinaire's Soirée de Paris, and this is the issue that has the calligram of the letter Ocean on it. This was a very low-cost production. Each one to make and print and edit or whatever they did was 200 francs, so it was pretty sort of nominal. And the sort of production values were sort of in imitation of the Mercure de France, with this chocolate brown cover, which is faded, and the mustard coloured paper stock. There's the interesting thing about this. It does on the back cover, inside back cover, it does advertise the prose of the Trans-Siberian, the Sandra and Delaunay production. And more Parisian magazines, but one is a manifesto. This is the second Surrealist manifesto, was issued in December 29, and this was the last issue of this particular Revolution Surrealiste number 12. This was funded by a character we're going to see later on called José Corti, because Gallimard had refused to print and publish and distribute it. And Minotaur number 6, with its Man Ray photograph of two works by Duchamp, it has a very high production standard. This is Skira Tériade, and as Tériade is going to be discussed later, I'll skip them for that. So what I'm going to do now is look in more detail at the different movements and their attitude to a deluxe edition. And we're starting with the Italian Futurists, and we've got this statement here by Marinetti in the Destruction of Syntax of 1913. I initiate a typographic revolution aimed at the bestial, nauseating idea of the book of Pessiès and Denuncian verse on 17th century handmade paper, bordered with helmets, Minervas, Apollos, elaborate red initials, vegetables, mythological missile ribbons, epigraphs, and Roman numerals. So the question is, did the Italian Futurists keep to this hostility to special, luxurious editions? So we can start by looking at Marinetti's own press, Poesia. And Claudia Solaris has done what I call a bibliography of that press. And there are 92 titles, and there's only one that has a special a version, and it's a heavier cover and a different color of the cover. So I set out to find some copies of the deluxe edition, and it was a lot more difficult than you can imagine. I traced what were 3 copies, and this is one of them, but the Getty copy turns out to be an ordinary edition one, although it does have a dedication in it. But the Yale copy and this copy, which I have acquired for the Frick library, is the real thing, and it's dedicated to Virgilio Marchi, who you probably haven't heard of, but he was a futurist architect, not as famous as Santalia, but he was more known to the public because he was a popular and his sort of film sets in particular and theatre sets. He did a massive number of those. So we've got this deluxe copy and that's a close-up of the paper texture of the cover. And interestingly, on the right is the back of this beast, as I call it, but it has the price of the ordinary edition on it, which for me suggests that this was an out of commerce edition anyway. And maybe, I don't know, 5 copies most. I think we can excuse Marinetti that he kept to his word, and this is really the black swan of the publishing history of poesia. And of course, the ultimate Italian futurist book was his Marinetti Tullio dal Bisola 1932 production, and known otherwise as the Tin Book. And this was, it was the sort of lithographic process called litolatter, patented by his Marinetti and Dal Bisola's publisher, Nosenso in Savona. There's no paper involved at all, and that's the ultimate Italian futurist book, is something that celebrates industry and the future. This slightly earlier vaulted book by De Pero is obviously on paper or card in most cases, and there is the metal binding, but the special edition of it, and we don't really know the size of that special edition. There are arguments for 3, 4 to 5, 10, or even 100 out of the total 1,000 printed run. But that cover was an all-metal stainless steel cover for the limited edition. The only one that we're aware of is in Trento, the Castello del Bon Consiglio, and that's the only copy that I know of, at least. So what about the Russian and Ukrainian futurists? The rhetoric of them was similar. They deplored the symbolist writings of the Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and their actual values in terms of production were also anti-symbolist too. And we have this great example of a tango with cows printed on wallpaper, and found sort of bits of paper to stick over it, and it's trimmed and crudely in that top corner. And again, they tended to use reproductive processes that really, I would say, avoided presswork values and almost had values of zines. So they use lithography, stencils, hectograph on newsprint, wallpaper, anything they could find. And they celebrated, with this process, you could celebrate hand-drawn text and image. And that was their big sort of appearance. This world backwards, I don't think I've ever seen a copy that's the same. You can see in these 4 from MoMA in New York that the titles are at the top, at the bottom of the top 2 and at the top of the bottom 2, and the image is completely different, and they're completely different to the images at the Getty and at the British Library and in Paris, are the ones I've seen. So I think those 2 movements, we can say they weren't interested in the edition deluxe, although they have become items of great price and value now. So I don't know which movement we put this in, cubism, post-cubism, sort of surrealism. There's a whole range of things that could qualify for this one. It's interesting that the date 1913 is right in between the two Russian futurist books we've just seen, and it's showing a completely different value. It's press work on the right, and it is sort of individualized pochoir process on the left or the bottom in this illustration of it. This is the British Library's copy, which I acquired for the exhibition Breaking the Rules. Maybe I have to explain what a census is, as opposed to the big bibliography that lists every title of a author of a press. A census actually looks at every copy, if it can, of a particular edition of a title. And Kitty Marriott, who's done a facsimile of the prose of the Siberian Express, has been working on both the paper in the productions, but also on trying to track down the edition. Theoretically, it's an edition of 150, but I don't think that actually that number was finished. And the story has it that if you join them all up vertically, they will be the height of the Eiffel Tower. But of course, nobody's ever tried that. So vellum, of course, which isn't paper, and these are definitely on vellum as opposed to paper that looks like vellum. There was an edition of 8, 5 survive, and they were sold at 500 francs. And we know this because on the back of the Soirée de Paris, there's a price for the 3 editions given in that. And the Japan one, there was 27 copies of that. And the what we call the trade edition, the Simile Japan, was 111 altogether. And it's interesting how the survival rates have varied, that the more expensive formats have actually fared better in survival than the standard edition. So I'm going to jump from that now to the surrealists. And we're going to look at 3 bits of evidence. And the first one really is a publisher's catalogue from 1929 or 30. On the right is the front cover of it, and you can see the Magritte collage is dated Paris 1930, but might have been made in 1929. And the rest on the left is just a listing of publications for sale. But as you go down it, you'll see a listing of special editions. And I'm going to look at primarily the Breton ones, because we haven't time to do the rest. And this sort of brings in a local colour for Brussels in this one. This letter was sent by Breton to René Gaffé, who lived in Brussels. Probably not many of you know who Gaffé was, and he's a sort of interesting character. He was a spy for the French and Belgians in Amsterdam during the First World War, stayed on as a journalist for some Belgian newspapers and magazines. And then he made his fortune in perfume and was able to afford artworks. And he bought Cubist and Surrealist paintings and African and Oceanic art too. But he also collected editions of the Surrealists and others. And he liked to have the #1 of the numbered edition. And he has a really fantastic collection, which we'll come on to in the next one. But the first page, the one on the left, is Breton trying to sell paintings to Gaffé. And on the right, you probably can't see it, but on the 3rd paragraph Breton is trying to sell the manuscript of the second manifesto for 6,000 or 7,000 francs, and also what he calls the proofs of the mont de piété, the pawn shop or the pawnbrokers. And we can see what Gaffey bought, because he sold his books in a sale in Paris, and by this time he stopped sort of dealing with the surrealists. Eluard had tried to get him to pay so much for the Immaculate Conception, which is on the right, that he eventually did buy it, but he didn't buy anything else from Breton and Eluard after that. So this is a really great auction catalogue, and it is a fantastic source of information and the paper of lots of famous books for this period. So looking at the three things put together, the Corti catalogue and the sale, we find here that the second manifesto, there was a Club de Soissons with 60 editions, and Gaffey has #1 of that one. Also, he owned the manuscript too. And if we look at the Mont de Piété, I don't recommend you ever read that. It's the most boring set of Breton poems he ever did. But with an edition of 125 is listed in the bibliography of the Au Press by Fouché, and Corti, it's sold out in that, but it's mentioned. And the Gaffey sale, he has one of the imperial Japanese one, but it's got these editions of Breton's dedication and proof corrections, which might have been after the real proofs rather than the real proofs themselves. And in the letter that we looked at to Gaffey is the offer of the manuscript, which Gaffey did not follow up with. So Nadja was a slightly different, a bigger edition, and Corti has 2 original and an ordinary edition of that. And the Gaffey sale has 109, lists the original edition as being 109 copies, and then it has these additional annotations from Breton. And the manuscript of Nadja belonged to somebody else, to Mermod, and that's now in the Bibliothèque Nationale. And it came with this sort of extra letter when it was sold to Mermod. And again, I suspect that Breton was doing rather more ornate manuscripts for sale value later on. So most surrealists, like Breton, could hardly afford to publish by themselves. Picabia was probably the only one who could afford to. He had enough money to pay for it. So I'm suggesting a sort of economic model where you could sell the manuscript, you could sell the artist publisher's proofs if the publisher had given them back to you, and you could sell the corrected text. And then you could have a deluxe numbered edition, and you could then sell the ordinary copy. Then you could inscribe either of those 2 copies, and you could insert extras into either the inscribed or the ordinary copy. And hopefully Breton could then pay his electricity bill. So as I was preparing this, I read this article in the Grolier Club Gazette, and it's by Rick Gakowski, who's a publisher and auctioneer and writer. And this is very much an Anglo-American formula. he worked out after 20 years that this is what will make a book profitable. A trade edition of this, a number of copies, an immediate edition, quarter leather, and then a deluxe edition with Roman numerals and full leather. So this is not making the luxury ones from paper. It's very much an Anglo-American formula. And to conclude, I sort of then thought of that passage in Robert Darnton's The Great Cat Massacre, where he's doing a sort of an article on the reader's response to Rousseau. The reader of the old regime approached them with care, this is books, for he paid attention to the stuff of literature as well as its message. He would finger the paper in order to gauge its weight, translucence, and elasticity. A whole vocabulary existed to describe the aesthetic qualities of paper, which usually represented at least half the manufacturing cost of a book before the 19th century. He would study the design of the type, examine the spacing, check the register, evaluate the layout, and scrutinize the evenness of the printing. He would sample a book the way we might taste a glass of wine. Thank you.
And I'm going to present our next speaker, Poppy Sfakianaki. She is an art historian who researches interests focus on modern art and more specifically on the art press mediators in the art world, cultural transfer and the construction of the artist's image. And she's going to speak about the publication Verve by Tériade.
Okay. In 1927, the art critic André Varnon published an article on the renaissance of modern illustrated book, and in it he made the following comment, quote, "The creation of a book is an art. A book must be built like a monument. It is an object that must reach perfection and no detail is negligible." Varnon underlined the critical role of the publisher in obtaining the absolute unity of the published work and attributed the renaissance of illustrated books primarily to the direct engagement of the artists in engraving, citing Ambroise Vollard as the publisher who paved the way by asking Bonnard to illustrate parallèlement and Daphnis et Chloé. In 1945, Tériade expressed the same idea of books as monuments in a letter to Henri Matisse. So I think about jazz, and I would like it to be a monument in modern publishing. Greek-born publisher Tériade is considered as the one who picked up the torch from Vollard. He published luxurious art books illustrated or both text and image by eminent modern artists, and he was known for his attention to every single detail of the architecture of each book, so as to attain perfection both creatively and in terms of fidelity of reproduction. Bibliophily, a key feature of French culture since the early 19th century, flourished during the interwar years. From 1921 to 1931, French bibliophile associations increased fivefold from 7 to 35, and many periodicals aimed at book lovers were established. Special value was attributed to illustrated books whose annual number more than doubled from almost 500 in 1923 to more than 1,100 in 1928. Illustrated books were exhibited in art and book exhibitions. A Salon International du Livre d'Art took place at Petit Palais in 1931, and the Comité National du Livre Français Illustré was established in 1937. Apart from their aesthetic value as collector's items, illustrated books also acquired value as a form of financial investment, thanks to the art market boom during those years. The connection between art publishing and art trade was sealed by the foundation of Syndicat des éditeurs d'art et négociants en tableau moderne in 1925. Aware of this interest in illustrated books, especially among the collectors of modern art, Tériade thought of books as art objects. From 1926 to 1936, he built a solid career in the Parisian art press, working as an art critic for the modern art journal Cahiers d'Art and the popular daily L'Intransigeant, among others, and as the artistic director of the art journal Minotaur, promoting mostly post-Cubist and post-Fauvist trends. Then, from 1937 to 1975, he devoted himself to his own publishing house, Les Éditions de la Revue Verve, producing luxurious modern art publications that included the journal Verve and the books that famous artists such as Matisse, Picasso, Leger, Chagall, and Miro illustrated or created in full. Tériade's correspondence with artists and printers allows us to follow all the stages to book creation, from genesis to realization to reception. Tériade's original vision for his books, based on both his love for modern art and his admiration for medieval illustrated manuscripts, was to create a modern manuscript. He wrote to Matisse, quote, "And still this old idea keeps me awake at night, the modern painting manuscript. This has never been done. It corresponds so well to today's capacities, and it could be wonderful." The essence of his vision is described in more detail in an excerpt from a letter to Georges Rouault. Quote, "The basic idea of the publication is to make a manuscript, painted and written by you, and that the reproduction be so perfect that you forget as much as possible about the idea of reproduction. You know my old idea about this, that having the means of reproduction so perfected, which can always and after each case be further perfected, the painter should not be hindered, influenced by the technical capabilities of reproduction, nor bent to engrave himself, nor modify his colors. If you make dazzling colors, they must be reproduced in their intensity. It is possible to achieve this, and one will have in front of your manuscript the feeling of your hand tracing with a brush. And the value of the publication will be in this fidelity, and especially in the fact that the painter has maintained all the freedom to express himself as he had wanted, without being concerned about what can or cannot be reproduced, and without making any concession to the reproduction process." Rouault, Matisse, Bonnard, and Laurence were the first artists to whom Tériade proposed book projects around 1941. At first, they were all skeptical about this idea and concerned about the quality of the reproductions, but eventually they all responded positively because of the symbolic and relational capital that Tériade had as a mediator in the art press, but mostly because they had already collaborated with him for his journal Verve, and were happy with the exceptional and unique materiality of its issues, namely their large format, the use of different kinds of high-quality papers, the fine typography and neat layout, and the use of original engravings. Moreover, Tériade used various printing methods in order to obtain the best possible reproduction of each artwork and collaborated with eminent printers. For lithographs, he worked with Fernand Mourlot, whose name was linked to the revival of lithography, especially for the creation of posters for exhibitions. For heliogravures in color, he used Drège Frères, a major printing press that employed all the latest typographical methods and had experience in art publications. Tériade collaborated with the same people for his books, intending to prove that the typographical and iconographic tradition could continue to exist in a contemporary form. However, the moment when Tériade decided to publish his first books in the early 1940s, during the German occupation of France, was not opportune. Even though the artistic and ideological ground was fertile for the publication of illustrated luxury books, there were three major obstacles: censorship, lack of paper, and the geographical dispersal of artists, since many had left Paris. To overcome the first two obstacles, Tériade transformed the issues of his journal Verve into facsimiles of medieval manuscripts, a choice that was in line with his personal taste, but most importantly conformed to the ideology of the Vichy regime, which meant that he would have no problems with censorship and be able to obtain the quantities of paper and other materials that he needed for his publications. Moreover, the only issue of his journal dedicated to books, dedicated to modern art, as well as his books, included established French artists, namely Rouault, Matisse, Laurence, Bonnard, whose paintings were still exhibited in Parisian galleries and salons. It is to be noted that luxury publications did not cease in occupied France as long as they promoted the French cultural heritage. In 1944, the correspondent of Art Digest in Paris expressed his surprise at the plethora of art publications in Paris during the previous 4 years. And Matisse commented, quote, "The current number of luxury publications is staggering." As for the geographical obstacle, even though Tériade himself had moved to the French south, he had his partner and assistant Angèle Lamotte, who made all the necessary trips to Paris to make arrangements with the printers and oversee all the administrative matters. At the same time, the fact that Rouault, Bonnard, and Matisse also lived in the south of France must have facilitated working with Tériade. Most books published by Tériade were conceived and commissioned by him. Furthermore, he participated actively in their creation by discussing with and guiding the artists and by providing art supplies to them, but mainly with his fervent care for the best possible printing result. Since Tériade did not want to put pressure on the printers so that this should not prove detrimental to the quality of the printed books, he often had to pacify the artists who protested about delays in the publication of their books. Apart from Laurence, who used woodcuts, and a few artists who made etchings, Tériade encouraged most artists to make lithographs because he believed that they could preserve the freshness and spontaneity of art creation with no restrictions on the color scale. Work on the lithographic stones was done at Mourlot's studio, either by the artists themselves and or by professional engravers, such as Theo Schmid, who curved the stone after the artist's drawings. In all three cases, the artist had to see and approve the final proofs. The types of paper used were of high quality, most of the times Velan d'Arche, and sometimes Montval and Velan d'Erive. The copies printed were around 250, and some books were accompanied by a limited number of deluxe albums containing only the engravings printed on even more luxurious paper, often larger in size, and signed one by the artists. The prints were on separate sheets of paper that were not bound together so that they could be easily detached and resold individually. The exhibition catalogue of 300 chefs-d'œuvre en facsimile, organized by the Bibliothèque Nationale in 1940, commended Verve for the extraordinary quality of its facsimiles. Indeed, the challenge for Tériade and what stressed the artist was to faithfully reproduce the colors of the originals. In a letter to Rouault, Tériade reassured him that he would use for his book the same printing techniques that he had used for the medieval facsimiles, which could render color in all its intensity. This issue comes up often also in his abundant correspondence with Matisse. Matisse felt that the four-color process used at the time resulted in an unsatisfactory imitation of the original colors. After he created the cover of the 8th issue of Verve with the cutout technique, Tériade, who had a book project in mind, tried hard to convince him about the potential of this technique, which could lead to alternative and more accurate methods of printing in terms of the intensity of the colors of the original. Matisse was very reluctant, and Tériade, or most properly Lamotte, suggested that he use the same lineal inks that printers used, which also offered an extensive palette, and color himself the sheets of paper before cutting them. Tériade promised him that in this way the prints would have the same color quality as the originals. Thus, Matisse agreed to do jazz. But still, the artist was reluctant about the fidelity of the result, and his reluctance seemed to affect the creative procedure. Quote, "My new plates have more simplicity of line and color elements. Not that I particularly wanted this, but it came most naturally, knowing how difficult it is to reproduce these creations." For the most faithful result, engraver and Montverel proposed to use the technique of pochoir and to fill the gaps with the same lineal colors that Matisse had used for creating his compositions. It should be noted that these colors were produced exclusively for jazz. Matisse was convinced, but could not fight his perfectionism. Quote, "The purple you must seek at all costs is necessary, indispensable. Without it, there will be no jazz, I can tell you that." Tériade's love for color did not stop him from publishing compositions in black and white, respecting the preferences of the artists, as was the case with Matisse's Lettres Portugaises or the books that Chagall illustrated, originally commissioned by Vollard. However, he insisted that Chagall use color for the deluxe edition of his illustrations of the Bible, according to what the artist wrote to his daughter Ida in April 1955. Quote, I sent Hassan 4 proofs of the Bible from Tériade's album to be colored. It's Tériade who wants me to color them. I don't particularly. In this case, Tériade's motive may have been the knowledge that color illustrations attracted more interest from collectors and thus had a higher commercial value. Tériade believed that illustrations should not simply be adapted to or complement a book's text, but that they constituted its plastic equivalent. Therefore, his goal was to create an organic whole through the interplay of text and images on equal terms, and this was an idea that many artists shared as well. The illustration of Pierre Verdi's Le Chant des Morts by Picasso is a good example of that. According to Françoise Gillot, Picasso considered Reverdy's handwriting a drawing in itself and was perplexed about finding the right way to organically integrate his illustrations with the text so that the book's unity would be complete. Eventually, Picasso decided to intervene in Reverdy's handwriting through an abstract and highly evocative style of drawing. The dynamic, autonomous presence of red ink, placed with wide strokes in the form of a line, dot, or arabesque, sometimes defines the space of the handwritten text and sometimes aggressively penetrates into it, referring directly to the horror of war, which was the theme of the book. With regard to the artist's books, Tériade insisted that the artists write their text by hand in order to reinforce the idea of the organic whole and their conception as modern manuscripts, in which both handwriting and illustrations were forms of artistic expression. Even though many artists resisted, they finally realized and accepted the aesthetic and expressive value of handwriting. Matisse wrote about jazz, quote, I felt that handwriting was a perfect fit for what I wanted to do. The large size of the writing seems necessary to me to be in a decorative proportion to the color surfaces. Given the purely visual and plastic function of the text, Matisse did not even correct the grammatical and syntactical errors he made, believing that this would disturb the rhythm of his writing. In the same spirit, Bonnard wrote to Tériade about his book Correspondance, quote, I thought a lot about our little book. I think handwritten letters would do better than print. They would give an impromptu look. Bonnard wished to create the impression of an improvised album or diary created at his youth. The spontaneous character of his drawings corresponds to the fresh and childlike look of the handwritten letters from his youth that he included in it. In order to reinforce the impression of casualness, Bonnard glued the printed illustrations onto the book, while he used the same purple ink for both drawings and letters in order to create a unified image. Despite the impression of imperfection, Bonnard made several versions of the images and wrote the letters again and again in order to obtain a result that satisfied him. With the exception of Matisse's books, it was Tériade who decided, together with the artists, the final form of each book, doing the final selection of the compositions to be included. That is why he was the one who, according to the contracts, kept the mock-ups with the original gouaches. It is also likely that since he was so actively involved in all the stages of his book's creations and production, he saw himself as their co-creator, which justifies the personification of the name of his publishing house that appears as Tériade Éditeur on the title pages of his books instead of its official form of Édition de la Revue Verve. Judging from both Tériade's correspondence and the reception of his publications in the press, the end product satisfied all: Tériade, the artists, the printers, as well as the art dealers, the critics, and the bibliophiles. Bonnard was one of the many artists who were delighted with the fidelity of the reproductions in their books. Quote, I find the reproductions of the drawings very good. They are true facsimiles. If there had been fingerprints, I think that they too would have been reproduced. Of course, not everyone was as happy. For instance, Matisse acknowledged that in technical terms, the best possible result had been achieved in jazz, but he felt that the change in scale had harmed the sensitivity of his works. Picasso as well, when he finished the illustration of Le Chant des Morts, proposed to do it all over again, following a different approach, but Tériade refused, and besides, Reverdy was enthusiastic about the result. To conclude, Tériade wanted the reproductions in his books to be so perfect that the reader would forget that they were not original works. Eventually, he succeeded in publishing books that were and still are seen, as he wished, as monuments of modern publishing with exceptional artistic value. Treating them as art objects, official institutions such as the Museum of Modern Art in Paris exhibited most of them soon after their publication, and the books have been accepted as part of the French cultural heritage. Furthermore, renowned art dealers such as Louis Carré, Hansberg Gruen, and Pierre Berès in Paris, or Pierre Matisse in the United States, also acknowledged their artistic and, from their point of view, also commercial value. Even if many of Tériade's books were not innovative in artistic terms, Tériade was among those who, like Albert Schira and Aimé Mectre, broke new ground with the impeccable materiality of his books, the extensive use of color lithography as a printing method, the organic unity between text and image, and his idea to ask artists to compose text of their own for their books and actually write them by hand. As a reminder of the continuing appreciation of their importance, we can only mention that one of the 250 rare and precious items of the permanent Polanski exhibitions of the New York Public Library's Treasures, opened in September 2021, is just by Matisse.